Hi there, this is Rick Echevarria, who's running for City Council in District 37. Welcome, Rick.
Thank you.
How are you today?
I'm well.
Good, good. Uh, First, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and some of your campaign and what you're doing now?
I was born and raised in Bushwick. Started my career in public service with East Brooklyn Congregations. And then I started a housing organization called Bushwick Housing Independence Project in Bushwick. Spent some time after that working on the subprime crisis, the group called Changer. And then most recently worked for the City of New York's Department of Housing Preservation and Development. And I'm running for City Council in the June Democratic primary.
Okay, that's not. There's a special election before that, isn't there?
Yes, I'm not running in that particular race. That's supposed to be on April 28th, but I think it's going to get pushed back and possibly merged. I'm not sure how they're going to work that out. But
okay, who are the candidates running there?
No free advertisement.
Okay, I got you. Your community is basically working class and lower income families. Is that correct?
Yes, we have a predominantly the largest ethnic group is Latinos, mostly Puerto Ricans and Dominicans. Working class. We have a sizable African American population as well. But most of the district is getting, again, the early signs of gentrification in terms of price rises, but you're not getting a transition in population that you've seen in Williamsburg or parts of West Bushwick.
How are they faring through this pandemic?
There's a lot of misinformation. I think on the ground, we've spent a lot of time on the ground at the places where people buy essential products before the essential businesses were actually designated essential. There's a lot of confusion, even suspicion and doubt that this is actually happening. I think over the last few days, those suspicions started to diminish, and some of these cases are hitting very close to home around the district.
You actually went out to the vendors in the neighborhood with a pledge to not gouge the public. How is that going?
Yeah, we got some initial complaints of vendors or merchants raising prices. And so we want to get their commitment. And it didn't take commitments to not price gouge. And it didn't take long after 2 or 3 merchants to realize that there was a problem behind the merchants, which were the suppliers of these dollar stores or 99-cent stores, as we more commonly know them to be. And that it is the suppliers that are price gouging. And so it's a sad situation, because I think there's this expectation that there's normal processes are playing out where people can just buy and sell, and they're not. These stores are without products, and that's actually before the demand hit. It just kind of disappeared. The owners didn't want to pay the higher price. The managers didn't want to pay the higher prices, and so they weren't restocking the products.
You also were looking into, apparently there are a lot of dollar stores in your community, and that they're basically being run by larger groups, possibly funded by Carl Icahn and Wall Street.
Yeah, so this is, I think, the really troubling part of this is that the dollar store model has been exposed for what it is. It is a neighborhood shop, or it's guised as a neighborhood shop, where the merchants or the managers have very little information about the products that they sell. They can't orient their clients to how to effectively use the products. When a handful of suppliers started price gouging or shutting down, that was the end of the ballgame, right? Like to these merchants and managers, they didn't look for alternative suppliers, right? It was just kind of like, my relationship is with these, handful of suppliers, and if they don't have the stock, surprisingly, what some of the merchants and managers were telling the customers were the manufacturers were out of the products, right? Which we tried to kind of clarify to them that no, the manufacturers are not out of these products. It's a specific, these specific suppliers are the problem. But there was a lot of resistance. There's a lot of resistance. There's a lot of fear. I think there's some relationships to these suppliers that we have to question. The merchants seem to be nice people mostly, but they don't own these places. Most of these
They're predominantly immigrants, aren't they?
predominantly immigrants, and they're agents of. And mostly agents. Very rarely did we encounter someone who actually owned their shop, right? And that to me is troubling. That when you say, okay, across this region of Brooklyn, there are hundreds of stores like this, and this is what we're relying on to provide the essential products in these essential businesses. It's frightening to me. I'm like, this is not going to happen, right? These stores are not going to meet the need right now.
Well, it's kind of like capitalism playing the lamb instead of the wolf in the neighborhood, trying to get both ends of the community, the high end and the low end.
Yeah, and this is what I when you get close to it, what you realize is that this is a model that works faster than Amazon. Right, like if that were possible, and it is, because what the merchants do is they respond to what is immediately hot, going, hot for sale, and they'll restock 2 or 3 times in a day because suppliers are just a few blocks over. And so, I caught merchants coming back from like, where are you? I just came back from the supplier. Were you there this morning? They said, yeah, we restock quickly. So, which explains why they have such a diversity of products. Yeah. They don't really have any deep understanding of any of the stuff that they're selling, right?
You and I, when I was in your community, visited a NYCHA building that had recently converted to RAD. Can you fill us in on what's going on there?
So I just want to be clear that the privatization of public housing is something that I oppose. I grew up in public housing. I believe in the institution of public housing. I understand its need and its importance. And I think that we should not accept excuses based on a history of decades of mismanagement, neglect, and corruption as the reason for the transition to privatization. I think that we are headed in a very dangerous situation. That we're seeing the rapid conversion to RAD, which is a privatization effort here. The development where I was raised has transitioned. I suspect that part of the reason that was able to happen is because we have a large Spanish-speaking elderly population that couldn't really mobilize to kind of resist here. But across the district in the developments that I've been in, there is an opposition to privatization, but there's also, and sometimes we have to acknowledge this, there's also a frustration. People just want repairs. People are tired of living under conditions where their buildings have been neglected, and so they kind of welcome anything that will just lead to the rehab or renovation of their units and resolving of housing, poor housing conditions.
Yeah. So on the surface, they see their apartments being repaired, but they're also putting themselves in jeopardy of higher rates of eviction.
And that is the danger. I think as part of this campaign, we have been going out. We feel the need to do community education piece here. So for people to make an informed decision, my sense is that the majority of residents will get it and will understand that privatization is a dangerous thing. And I wanna go and take a leap here and say, as someone who grew up in public housing, we sometimes have to realize that it's public housing is not just about the residents of public housing. It's about the city. It's about our society, right?
That's correct.
Right. So even if 40% of residents, would want, if 60% of residents would want privatization, and we understand why, that's still, we should still preserve public housing because that was the purpose of it. It's a counter to the crisis that capitalism perpetually creates around housing issues. That's the bottom line. That was its original purpose. It was very effective, and the neglect and mismanagement of it, I think, was purposeful to undermine its success. But I cite an example, right? The first houses, right? Mixed use, right? You have buildings, development where you have commercial properties contributing income to sustain the development. And the real estate lobby of the time, back when that development was created, intervened rapidly and say, okay, the next developments, they can't have this model, right? Like, we don't want these things to succeed. And I think that's the long battle that public housing has faced, is the oppositional forces to it, not wanting public housing to succeed.
Right, they're criminalizing poverty. You can't help people out in the subway. It's just a terrible approach because government was meant to help the people, not make them criminals.
So yeah, and but I'm glad I sensed that going out to these developments that people get it, they understand it, they want to preserve public housing, and the responsibility is, to me, is squarely municipal here on accountability and management and transparency and avoiding neglect. And I get the whole thing about the lack of federal support, consistent support and financing for this, but rarely do I agree with what's coming out of HUD or the Oval Office. But we have to take responsibility. We have to take. We have to look inside and say we need to change this.
This pandemic is going to make issues even harder because even though Trump denies the possibility of going into a recession or possibly a depression, these companies that have been out of work for so long are going to need help. The people are still going to have to pay those back payments of whatever, it's their mortgage or their rent or something like that, whatever that is. And they're going to need additional help. But the government is going to be tightening the screws. They're going to lower the money probably in HUD, which affects the states and the city. And I think we need to prepare ourselves to fight those cuts.
Yes, and I think what is important about this particular race and races of late is that we have this kind of divide between what needs to be done on a policy side, progressive policies, and our working class communities and population that tend to be, mostly African American or Latino, largely union, largely and working class jobs, who are not fully engaged in this kind of progressive conversation, and sometimes they just feel like it doesn't relate to them based on where it's coming from, right, and who's presenting it. And I think the progressive community, and I just have to be honest, has to take a hard look in the face, but in the mirror, and say, we need to build better relationships with uh, working class residents and
Yeah, I
people.
call that the New York liberal, where
Yeah,
the uptown Manhattan liberals come across and they say, "We want to help you, but don't come in our neighborhoods. I'm not going to shop in your stores." Yeah,
right.
it's the attitude that we're better than you, even though people claim to be on the left, and most of them are not.
I mean, it starts. So to me, like I mentioned, my first job organizing was with IAF, the East Brooklyn congregations, and it was like, there was no classism, and you just knock on doors and you go to meetings. And so when your meetings start to look like almost monolithically, one ethnicity, you have a problem, right? Like even if it's
Sure.
just black, if it's all Latino, if it's predominantly white, I mean, those are the signs, and you can't just say, well, we'll get around to addressing this issue eventually. You can't, because I think people feel, um, they're careful about the history of discrimination, of being marginalized, excluded, put to the side around community issues. So when you have a meeting that's entirely black or just mostly white, people just don't want to participate. Who are different, right? And I think that is what we need to change. We need to bridge this these two forces and execute here. We have to execute. We can't have our working class communities not absorbing and pushing progressive policies.
No. When I was a kid, it was probably more of my parents' generation, but there was still some leftover that the Irish and Italian were always struggling and competing against each other. And today I see that with the Black and the Hispanic communities doing the same. And it's important that we bring them together. It's not them against us, which they always try to create those situations where people are more and more divided when that's not what we need.
Mhm.
So, uh, how would you go about bringing those people closer together, though?
I think that it takes the right leader. It takes the right person who can inspire and speak to diverse groups. All right, we can't have this polarization on the local level, and I think we're seeing too much of that. This
Mhm.
kind of false, um, two-sided thing between the progressives and the machine, and it's a bunch of BS, right? Because as Errol Lewis pointed out in the article, there are a lot of people who are part of the Brooklyn Democratic Party who have been very progressive around policies, right? So don't paint them as not progressive. And then on the other side, the progressives sometimes exhibit a lot of discriminatory approaches towards things, right? Where you don't get included in conversations, where decisions are made by people who don't, look like you.
Mm.
So, we're at a point where new leaders must have to emerge, and, without casting blame, just kind of acknowledging the problem. And we need people who can speak to both sides here and build something new, right? To grow out of these efforts. But most voters are Democrat. Most working class voters are Democrat. It is what it is. Right?
Well, one of the things that drives me nuts, and I talk about this basically on every episode, that the politicians mainly just don't listen to the people. How many rezonings has the city gone through? And community boards have gone one way, city planning has gone the other way, and then the city councilman comes along and agrees with the planning board, ignoring what the people say, ignoring what the community board has said. Uh, how would you approach situations like that?
Well, I think that um, we have to address the critical problems that we have around what's expedient in terms of housing policy, and and what's hard to do. And I think re-energizing, remobilizing people in public housing is something that people conceptually think is very hard to do. Right? I don't think it's hard to do if you really engage in an effort there. I think that we need to win people over to the idea that it's not a supply problem, right? Where we're just getting these kind of like 80-20 models that's going to solve this. I think we have fundamental economic problems, right? One of the wisest answers that I've ever heard about how to solve the housing crisis came from an academic, right, who said, "Raise incomes." Like raise incomes, right? If you raise incomes, then this wouldn't be a problem. And I think that's part of the affordability issue here. People being squeezed out, housing is being rationed, right? Affordable housing is being rationed. You don't build community in ways like that. Now, it looks visually attractive, but increasingly we have people who can't afford to live in the city or neighborhoods where their networks exist, that those networks have exponential impact on the economy and their lives, right? Or for getting jobs, for getting support with health issues and things like that. So we're creating, we're creating a society or a city where when these issues get exposed in a crisis like this, right? Everything just comes boom, and it's like here are all the problems all at once, right? And that is the real danger here with this public health crisis. It's not just the fact that people are going to be sick and could, die, but it's the systems around it that are not functioning, right? They're just not functioning here, right?
Yeah. And a lot of it is coming, again, from capitalism, where corporations want the lowest paid workers so they can make a greater profit. The trade deals that have been made over the last couple of decades send all of our manufacturing overseas. We currently have our medicines where 90% of the elements in the medicines are made in China. There are certain products and systems that need to be done here for the people's own safety, and that's the situation we're in now.
Well, let me interject there, right? So people, I've spoken to some people of like, what is an appropriate local response to this? And one of the things that I propose is we need to identify a supply of products here, right? It's like, well, in the market, yes, in the market, we need to identify a supply of products because these suppliers, right, these kind of like vulture-ish suppliers, they don't want to meet the need right now. They just don't want to go to jail, right? So it's like they're shutting down and they're like running and hiding. So we need to identify a supply. And sitting in Ohio, there's a company and say, hey, I make some EPA approved products, Rick, and we can get them to you. Get us a willing merchant. And no one from New York City has called us. And we're surprised, but we want to help. We want to save lives, right? We're an American company. Our product is made right here in Ohio. We don't have a supply problem going forward, and we can get you thousands upon thousands of units. So it speaks to what you just raised, right? Like the answers are there, but our communities are being offered this kind of model that is just based on extracting whatever wealth they have, right? Just get to the store, give us your money, and leave. Exactly. No information, no content. Now, I don't want to go too long on this, but I was reading something interesting about Home Depot, right? Kenneth Langone this morning. And this whole concept, he was really gloating about the successes of Home Depot, right? Well, Home Depot displaced all the mom and pop shops, right? That knew what they were selling, okay? And he said, well, our model here is that, we have the workers, the lowest level workers, engage people and talk to them and, ask them what's going on. And, we want people coming here and feeling well treated, right? Okay, so now by establishing Home Depot, the mom and pop shops are gone, the dollar stores proliferate, right? And now in this crisis, Home Depot doesn't have supplies, the dollar stores don't have supplies, and nobody knows what they're doing.
Mhm.
Right? So it's like we have a what I term the billionaire problem, right? And this kind of exhibits it most clearly, right? Langone happens to be the chairman of NYU Langone,
Right.
a hospital that is part of a system that has consolidated over the last decade, and we've closed down 13 hospitals, right? And now we can't service these people who are sick and need medical attention. So, we're in a crisis that is exposing our problems with inequality and economic injustice at the highest levels. Like if you can't see it now, you're never gonna see it, right? And if someone like Kenneth Langone doesn't get it right now, he's never gonna get it, right? So he wrote a book. Excuse me, I get a tissue here. Um, he wrote a book called "I Love Capitalism," right? Yeah. Well, here's the answer. You shouldn't love capitalism, right? Because right now you're seeing that the tragic thing about capitalism is that when you see that it doesn't work, it is pretty catastrophic.
Right.
It's not pretty.
Well,
And
you
this,
talked about the closing hospitals, where the governor currently is saying that we need 143,000 beds for the peak of this pandemic. But he also was involved in helping the hospitals. Long Island College Hospital, which was the neighborhood I grew up in, and I lived 2 blocks away from it. And so many people I grew up with worked there. And
co-ops and condos.
he wanted to sell it because of the value of the property. And, right now it's just a big hole in the ground. There's nothing there. They're beginning to build something, but right now it's just a hole in the ground. You have someone on your staff, Lewis, who worked to keep St. Vincent's open. Our mayor used the Long Island College Hospital to become mayor because he was going to save it. Well, in my mind, he just used the people and that as an excuse. So the people have to pay more attention to the interrelationships between government and the real estate agents in the city. So I'm sorry, you just touched a nerve with me there for a minute.
13 hospitals, 13 hospitals, right? And because they couldn't afford insurance anymore. You couldn't afford the insurance. I mean, it's just remarkably foolish on our part to have this situation now. And the problem is that we don't have enough space. Right? We're going to have to build hospitals, right?
Yeah, we're going to. Well, in the neighborhood that I grew up in when I was a kid, there were 3 major hospitals in the neighborhood. Today, none of those exist. There's an emergency room where Long Island College used to be, where Lagoon is operating it now, but the basic hospitals are all gone. It's not the situation that we need when we are in the middle of a pandemic. So anyway, but going forward with your campaign, though, what are the major? You touched on housing. What are your feelings towards small business? Would you be a supporter of the Small Business Jobs Survival Act, or
yeah,
what?
yes, and in addition to that, I think this is an opportunity for communities across New York City, and I intend to work towards this to establish a different paradigm of our local businesses and how they service our needs. I think the dollar store era needs to come to an end. I think that we need to regulate how closely they can operate in vicinity to each other. And with that regulation, I think we'll see a rapid decline in their existence. I don't feel, it's very uncomfortable to go into a store and the managers don't know the products that they sell, right? I mean, these products aren't even at the front of the store when you come in now under shelter in place, right? Like nobody's thinking, nobody's trying to meet a need. It's just extraction of whatever dollars you have left, right?
But the demise of the mom and pop stores really kill off the cultural needs of communities. Again, when I was a kid, each neighborhood had a different ethnicity and their cultures were different from community to community. And the stores reflected that. Now, with the urbanization of New York City, that's changing and the people are losing their cultures. That's what brought people to New York. Now it's gone. So.
Yeah, I mean, we've transitioned to providing those opportunities and service, right? So, like Uber drivers, right? So we have tons and tons of Uber drivers. In many cases, some immigrant Uber drivers will have as many as 4 or 5 cars that they sublease to other drivers. So, I mean, those kind of things I think, are good in a temporary sense. But then comes in some regulation or some situation like this, and it stops overnight, right? And so, yeah, we need to think about what that new models or different models look like in our communities. And I would tell, I think one of the things that I want to be clear about uh, is that other city council members around the city right now should be very concerned about assumptions. Do not assume that people in your district are going to be able to effectively prevent the virus in their homes, because the normal shops that they go to don't have these supplies, right? And I know that's kind of like unbelievable to think that that's possible, but that's what's happening. And it's not a demand issue, right? I spoke to a major supplier this morning, and he kind of hinted, well, he hinted two things. He said that people are hoarding this stuff up, right? And the other thing he said was that he's beginning to see an extension of the price gouging into the disinfectant service area, where companies are professional cleaning services that actually disinfect for COVID-19 are drastically jacking up their prices here as a major opportunity to exploit, to gain money. But yeah, so you should be thinking about how these people, city council members across the city, and candidates, right? Because we need the candidates to press the buttons here. These stores don't have. Take a walk from 2 or 3 stores, you see they don't have the products. The information is not out, and it's a crisis. It's a crisis.
Well, one final question is that, do you see this pandemic changing our society in any way? Or will it just go back to normal 3 days after it's over?
I hope to God that tragedy could be limited. I think I think we'll still have a government, but I think a lot of things related to our way of life will drastically change. And what people should pay attention to is that we will be creating that new way of life in the process of our response to this particular crisis. So whoever has the capacity to manage, and this is where I agree with Governor Cuomo on. If you have the capacity to do this work, do this work. It's a calling. People who can put things together need to be putting things together now. I get, advocating for the policies. We need that, but we need right now. These communities need people who can put things together, right? Because it doesn't appear that the mayor or city hall is effectively putting things together right now, and that's unfortunate.
One of the things I brought up in an interview yesterday was mutual aid groups, where I feel that particularly the mayor and the city council should be putting groups together. If there's nothing happening in a community, it's the city councilmen who should be doing that, making sure that there are a group of people that are willing to help others. Because this is not just, as Bernie says, it's not me, it's us. So that, again, that's my feeling, that it needs to come to a degree from City Hall. Anyway, how do people contact you and get involved in your campaign?
So email for our campaign is info@rickechevarria.com. The phone number is 929-282-5482. And we have a task force in development to respond to the crisis, the COVID crisis on a local level in District CD 37. And I'll be announcing that soon. We're currently mobilizing the members and participants of that task force so that we can launch a major prevention effort on the ground in the district.
Okay. Well, I appreciate you taking the time to speak with us,
Thank
and
you.
I wish you a lot of luck in your campaign.
Thank you.
Thank you.